Time for a quick ad break. Beyond Solitaire is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, and they are launching their Kickstarter campaign for 500-Year-Old Vampire at the end of March. Designer Jason Cox has adapted Tim Hutchings' solo RPG design to create a cooperative experience that can either be played among friends or as a creative exercise in classrooms. In fact, it is written to satisfy national English and art standards. This one is going to be good, so I recommend you check it out. I also want to put in a quick plug for myself. I absolutely love working on Beyond Solitaire, and I wish I had more time to put into it. You can help me make that possible by giving to my Patreon at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. My ultimate goal is to get to a point where I no longer have to teach summer school, so I can budget my time for game work and summer conventions instead. But no matter what, thanks for listening, and let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I am super excited to have on the show this week Dr. Martha McGill of the University of Warwick. How are you doing, Martha?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I am super happy to have you on. So I've invited you on to talk about your very cool gaming project, which is Witch Hunt 1649. But really quick first, why don't you tell us, kind of what you're doing in academia, what you're teaching, what your general field is, so we can get a sense of your awesome work.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a historian of the early modern supernatural broadly. My first project was on ghost beliefs in Enlightenment Scotland. And these days I'm working on possession, demonic, or various other forms, the ways in which angels could inject thoughts into people's heads, things like that. But this particular project was linked to the early modern witch trials, which is something you just can't really avoid if you are studying supernatural beliefs in this period.
Man, now I'm not sure I want to talk about this game. I want to know about demonic possessions and ghosts. But
be another conversation another time.
But so when we think about witch hunts in the United States, typically what we're thinking about is Salem. But how widespread were witch hunts actually, and how did they play out in the UK in different ways from the way they did in the United States?
Yeah, so Salem, of course, is very well known globally, but Europe was the big epicenter of witch hunts in the early modern period. Particularly certain parts of Europe, Central Europe, the sort of Germanic countries, was a real hotspot for witch hunting. My particular area of interest is Scotland, which also experiences pretty severe witch hunts. Relative to the American context, they get started quite a bit earlier. Scotland's first large-scale hunt is in the later 16th century. So we're rewinding a century from Salem. And in terms of how they play out, I suppose Salem, you've got sort of one case study, but it's unique. It's got a lot of sort of curious and interesting elements, themes about demonic possession and things which do not come in typically in the Scottish witch hunts. Looking at the Scottish hunts, it's possible to build a sort of more generalized picture that's free of the various idiosyncrasies that have made Salem so fascinating. So more commonly a picture of communities turning against particular individuals and then witch hunts snowballing from there into something that encompasses quite a broad range of people.
Oh, that's really interesting. And so you and some students decided to create a pair of games that together are Witch Hunt 6049 to kind of express this. So what made you decide to make games for the classroom? And then how did the project develop from there?
I've always been really interested in how we can use games as pedagogical tools. I was hesitant initially about taking this approach with the witch hunts because obviously it's a serious topic. People died, people were executed on completely fabricated charges, charges which to most people nowadays would seem completely fantastical. And as I say, these were real lives. So the first question for me was, is this an appropriate topic to approach through the medium of a game. So that was the sort of first point of discussion with the students with whom I was working on this. We felt we wanted to look at this topic on the other hand because it's something that there is persistently a lot of public interest in. A lot of people think they know things about the witch hunts. There are already quite a lot of games out there about witch hunting that have not been made from an academic perspective, and that perpetuate quite a lot of myths or sensationalize the whole topic. So we thought there was probably scope for trying to make something that handles the topic in a sensitive way, and that looks to take a kind of academic approach to educate people a bit, to encourage people to think about the realities of this and to feel empathy for the victims, even while also playing a game. We hoped it would be a way to sort of engage people who don't necessarily read textbooks about history. And at the same time, as we've mentioned, I wanted to use it as a teaching tool. So I also hoped it would be a way to get a new cohort of students sort of thinking about the topic in a slightly different way. I think it encourages a different kind of historical empathy when you're actually trying to put yourself in someone's shoes.
That's awesome. And so there are two separate games that emerge as part of this project. So Dregs of Days and Lying Lips. Can you tell us about each one and why did you end up with two games instead of just one? Like what caused the split?
It wasn't the original plan, but working in a group, you end up sometimes with creative differences. So we ended up going down two slightly different routes, two sort of subgroups. So the Dregs of Days, the first game, is a somewhat longer game. It's the more complicated of the two games. So when I'm speaking to people about how to use this in a classroom, I tend to say, use it if you've got a focused group who can spend 5 minutes sort of listening to rules and so forth. And if you're willing to devote half an hour of your class time to actually playing. So the Dregs of Days, within the group, it establishes pairs. So you'll typically have an ally among the other players. And then you and your ally are trying to ensure your subsistence, basically. You're trying to buy assets for your home, you're holding. At the same time, you're getting faced with various difficult events, which might be crop failures, livestock falling ill, the local church or kirk in Scotland breathing down your neck about something slightly questionable you've been up to or whatever. So you have to make decisions about how to respond to these events. As more of these events unfold, tensions build in the community, and finally those will trigger a witch trial. And then there's a process for playing out a witch trial. It doesn't go into a huge amount of detail about how trials would play out because we just couldn't fit it in to what was meant to be a reasonably concise game. But it does explore some of the different kinds of accusations that might be leveled against supposed witches. And then you try to evade the accusations. Possibly you will end up executed, although one of the concessions we made to turning this into a game is that we do not have as high an execution rate as would have realistically happened. We tended to find our playtesters got a little bit sad if they kept dying, basically. You've got a reasonable chance of getting acquitted, and then ultimately the person who manages to build up their homestead most rapidly will win, or the pair of allies who do that.
So it sounds like so it sounds like in this particular game, there is a whole lot of accusation fodder, but there's not any actual witchcraft. So what are the kinds of tensions that you're teaching people actually lead to these kinds of conflicts? And like how do you go from, well, darn it, my crops failed to witch?
That was something that was really important to us, not to have any real witches, because that is something you get a lot in the kinds of other games that are available on the witch hunts. It's common to have to find the witch, So we really wanted to get away from that sort of ahistorical approach. But yes, it was something that I think is really hard to do, and that I, to be honest, don't think the game does especially effectively, managing that jump from these are normal neighborhood crises, they're bad, but they're within the realm of what we might expect to happen. Outbreaks of the plague, periods of bad weather, periods of rising prices, whatever. How you get from that to you are being accused of fraternizing with Satan and of going to this nighttime sabbat where you feasted on the bodies of dead children. I think it's really, really difficult to process. I mean, I think it's difficult even for academic historians writing books on this stuff, let alone trying to condense it into a short game, So one thing we did to try and approach this is, I mentioned that when someone goes on trial, you get a sense of which accusations might be raised against them. So you have cards with your accusations. And we made a point of distinguishing accusations which came from the interrogators, which are your demonic stuff, the stuff we might today consider especially fantastical, the stuff about having sex with the devil, cannibalizing babies, and so forth. And on the other hand, accusations from neighbors, which tended to be much more rooted in those community concerns. So stuff like, my cow's fallen ill and I think this person did it. Or I had this bad dream and now my breast milk has dried up after I dreamt that my neighbor bit my breast. Or, my baby's fallen sick and I think it might be that person over there. We tried to show how at the trial stage you get these accusations from neighbors that have come out of these local difficulties. And it gets mixed with this demonic material that comes in from interrogators, from your elite figures who have been schooled in demonology and who are introducing these ideas at the interrogation and the trial phase. But I'm not sure how well that gets communicated over the course of an average game. I think, to sort of get the full historical value out of it, we'd always encourage people to go and read round it, read the further resources available on the website, look at the bibliography and so forth to get a deeper understanding of, how that odd switch happens from normal community troubles to witch hunts.
Awesome. And then what about Lying Lips?
So Lying Lips was created with the basic premise of making something much quicker and much easier to pick up. So it's got a very simple rule set. It's basically a trading game. You use the assets that are also used in the other game, which are things like plows, Bibles, tables, spoons, things people might conceivably have owned. And you trade them around the table. There is a rumor card that is sort of hidden and circulating around the table as people trade. This represents the currents of rumor, suspicion, tension in your village. And when somebody meets their trading goals, the game is over, or the first phase of the game is over, the trading phase. You then move to the trial phase, where the winner of the first phase becomes the trial commissioner, the person overseeing the trial. They can appoint some jurors, usually respectable local men, to help them. So some other people around the table take on that role. And then this little band have to identify who holds the rumor card. So who is the person who is spreading scandal, who is causing tension in the village. Because very commonly the people who got accused of witchcraft in this period were people who were known as scolds, was the common term, people who criticized others, people who cursed others, people who were associated with this sort of malignant use of words. So they have to identify the scold or the person who has been controlling these sort of dark rumors around the village. And depending on whether or not they do that successfully, you get different winners determined. Optionally, you can also play out this second phase, the trial phase, as a full role play of a witch trial. So you take on different roles depending on who is picked as having the rumor card, who has been picked as jurors, and so forth. Other players become witnesses, and the cards give you a brief little summary as to who your character is, what their motivations are, And there's a little bit of guidance also on how to play out a trial. So Lying Lips essentially is a sort of quicker thing. There's less educational material in the main game, but it can be used as a sort of engaging way to set up a witch trial roleplay if that's something you want to do in a classroom, or if people want to do it at home. It provides a little bit more information about what actually happened during trials and how they were conducted relative to the other game.
Oh, that's awesome. So, what kinds of classrooms are you envisioning these games will be played in? So you mentioned home. Would these be appropriate for both high school and college? What was your target audience at the time of creation?
So we say 14 plus as an age guideline. I mean, there are some dark themes in there, of course. Looking at the witch hunts, obviously themes of violence. There's some sexual content, references to accused witches supposedly having sex with the devil, things like that. So you need a class that's mature enough to handle that sort of thing. So university classrooms was what we had in mind as designers. And it could work especially well in university classrooms as well, because you often do have those smaller groups, which just makes it a little bit easier to manage. But it absolutely is usable in high schools for older and more mature students. And again, if you have a smaller class size where you can, as a teacher, manage the gameplay a little bit more. We usually recommend, groups of 4 or so for the first game, ideally, though it can take up to 7 players. It just takes a bit longer to play, or groups of 7 for the second game. But it's nice not to have too many of those little groups so that you can move between them. And yes, for family use as well, absolutely. As I say, it can be used up to 7, so it can be used in groups at home with friends, etc. As I mentioned, we just caution against introducing it to younger children. I mean, that would be at parental discretion, but as I say, there are some mature themes there.
Nice. And then, so this was done in collaboration with undergraduates. So how did you share that labor? I mean, you're the academic expert, but you want to involve students. So how did you mix kind of what you needed to happen academically and what they needed as students in this process?
So I already had a reasonable template of the game when I started working with students, because I just felt like if we began from scratch, we would never finish. Those early stages of game development, you go through so many different prototypes. It's constantly getting overhauled. You're constantly changing things, and it's really hard to do that with, I think, a lot of cooks in the broth, or a lot of people involved who all have different ideas on what direction the game should be going in, and so forth. So I came to the students with something that was reasonably well worked out in terms of sort of basic rules. There was scope to change things and to develop things and so forth, but I had a template. As I mentioned, we ended up splitting into 2 different groups and pursuing 2 different development paths. So I'm not sure if that entirely worked, but yeah, we weren't starting from scratch from the design point of view. Some of the students got on board with developing and refining the design, working on the other game. Another student took over the graphic design. Abigail Rylance, she oversaw all of the graphic design elements, and she did the vast majority of the pictures, the actual artwork for the game. And she did an incredible job on that. They're beautiful. Emmy DeVille, I'll mention as well, was the lead designer for Lying Lips, so she did a lot of work on bringing that together. And then a couple of the other team members worked on the research side of things. So, I mean, it's an area where I already knew a lot of the source material that was out there, but I invited them to go and look through this source material, gather useful quotations that we could bring in for flavor text, or just find sort of interesting scenarios that might make their way onto event cards, things like that, from the historical records, from the court records, from the church records as well. So yes, broadly, there was a sort of research group, a design group, and an art group or individual, really.
Nice. And what were you hoping that both they and players would learn from these games? Like, you can't include everything in a game. So what were like the essential concepts that you hope get across through play as opposed to reading around the topic?
So there were a few things we really wanted to communicate with the game. We wanted to look, first of all, at how witch hunts come out of this community context where people are facing troubles. It's a difficult life. It's not all doom and gloom. They have fun as well, but there are sort of regular crises, just challenging people's daily ability to get by, especially for those lower down on the social spectrum. And we wanted to show that, it's not evil people necessarily who are perpetuating witch hunts. It's normal human beings who are trying to get by, who are trying to survive, who are facing these challenges, and that the currents of suspicion against other people come out of that context. It's not necessarily that people are ignorant or people are malicious or people want others to suffer. It's that you've got this sort of tense situation where there's, as I mentioned, these challenges, and you've also got this deep belief that God is overseeing all this, that God is potentially punishing your community, that God has told you in the Bible not to suffer witches to live. And it's that sort of community context that ends up normalizing witch hunting and making it something that's not too weird and bizarre. So we did want to put people in the shoes of these totally normal people who then end up involved in these witch hunts, and show that it's more complicated than just the state is trying to stamp out women or something, which is one of the associations people have with the witch hunts, or it's elite figures trying to persecute those lower down on the social scale or whatever. We wanted to try and encourage empathy for everybody who gets caught up in the witch hunts. Obviously the victims are the people we should have the most empathy for, but the people who were accusing them were not necessarily evil and hideous or anything. They were normal human beings. And I think that's just important to have as something in the back of our minds when we think about how atrocities get committed, that often it is well-meaning in the first instance, and I think that's helpful, because if we just say, oh, these people were monsters, it sort of closes that door to analysis, to understanding. I think it's more helpful to be able to go, actually, people who do mean well can get led down this path of doing awful things. And it's important to recognize that that is sort of how evil creeps into our society, often with this sort of fair face of, in the case of the witch trials, being devout, doing what God wants you to do, takes various other faces when it comes to other forms of persecution. But yes, I think that was a big target for us. Just communicate that this was a sort of normal thing so far as possible, even though you get this weird, fantastical stuff sometimes introduced at the trial phase. It wasn't just women, it was mainly women, but it was not only women. So we do have male characters in the game as well who can get accused of witchcraft. And I think the other thing the game does, which was where I found it to be a real research challenge, is just communicate things about everyday life, like what sort of stuff would people have owned, or what kind of challenges would they have been facing day to day. Because this was where I had to go down a lot of research related rabbit holes. What farming equipment do people have? What stuff do they have in their homes? Very, very little, actually, as it turns out. We struggled with just getting enough bits of furniture or whatever to put on the cards, because homes were so sparsely furnished. And that kind of stuff was stuff that I just hadn't appreciated previously as a researcher, and that I think is sort of hard to really get into your head unless you're trying to really engross yourself in the past, unless you're trying to write historical fiction or something. Just those little details of people's day-to-day surroundings.
That's so interesting. And actually, you alluded to what was going to be my next question, which is I typically associate, the victims of witch hunts with women, in the community who maybe don't have as much of a traditional looking lifestyle as others. So, like, in the ancient Roman context, it's like the old lady down the road that you like get really suspicious of. So to what extent did that play out in the witch hunts that you were talking about? And when men did get involved, did they have any particular qualities that like what were the qualities of people who you'd accuse of witchcraft, and like how do we map that onto the gender disparity?
So the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, which was a project led by Julian Goodare and a team at the University of Edinburgh, which analysed a large body of witchcraft files, found that about 84% of those accused of witchcraft in Scotland were female, and then about 15% were male and 1% unknown. So yeah, we can see from that it is a large majority were female, but that it's not exclusively female. In some ways, it would be easier to explain if it were only women.
Yeah.
We do tend to find that, yes, the trials typically begin with women. So your sort of characteristic victim would be a woman, usually in middle age, usually of sort of middling social standing. It wasn't the most destitute. It was people who had enough respectability to have lots of ties to other people in their community, people who were trading with other people, whose life was bound up in those of the people around them, which just, I think, gave more opportunities for tension and for conflict to arise relative to, your destitute pauper or something. So people of middling social standing, middling age, and then people with a reputation for scolding, for cursing, for being argumentative. So yeah, that's where we get the sort of stereotypes of the kind of foul-mouthed old woman. So the witch trials would usually begin with these kind of figures on whom suspicion commonly fell. It was less pronounced for it to be midwives, that's a common stereotype, or healers, charmers, people who ostensibly worked in some kind of area of magic. Most usually it was just these sort of so-called normal people, people who had kind of common run-of-the-mill professions, nothing overtly magical. But then you see that when the trials do start to snowball, when accusations do get a bit broader, when you do start getting people pulled in who have been named by accused witches, then you get a broader church. That's when typically men start getting accused as well. So you tend to see more prosecutions of men in the trials, which go on longer and which encompass more people, because basically the more out of hand it gets, the less your authorities are discriminating in terms of who is getting pulled before the courts. So to be fair, that's not something we cover, especially in the games. Anyone can be your initial accusation. We didn't find a mechanic to try and sort of get the initial accusation towards women and then have it move out from there. But we do try to emulate the kind of snowballing thing. Typically after one file, you'll get others coming on more rapidly. So yes, women in the first instance, but then it does broaden out.
Interesting. So, is this your first game design, or had you already been designing games and this is the first one you decided to share with students?
First one that got anywhere. I've had a lot of sort of, doodles on the bedside table for years and so forth. But I think actually bringing in the students was a way to force myself to see it through as much as anything else, as well as, of course, having all of their wonderful input and insight and so forth, which was really invaluable. But yes, it's the first project that I've seen through like this. I was inspired by Professor Frank Clarkson at the University of Saskatchewan. He worked with a group of students to make this card game Virtus about medieval masculinity, which is beautiful and really engaging. So I'd recommend everyone go and have a look at that as well. It's available to buy via Etsy. But yeah, he and his students developed this game over the course of a module. And I was keen to try and do something similar.
Oh, that's really interesting. And then had you tried game-based learning in your classroom before? Or was that also new? Like the idea of playing games with your students as part of the learning process?
I'd done some role-playing that would be the closest we'd come to it. I hadn't done anything sort of more tabletop gaming style with boards or cards or anything. So yeah, it was fairly new to me again from that perspective. And it was, of course, one of the really difficult things about the project, trying to balance something that works as a game and something that tries to stay reasonably close to historical reality, and something that can be used in a classroom that's not therefore too long, because initially we were like, oh, and we want to educate people about this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And, you know, the first draft of the game went on for hours and would not have been usable in most classrooms. So, yeah, there were a lot of sort of different competing factors to balance. I mentioned the thing about executions, you know, a very rough guess, although it's hard to know, is that maybe about 2/3 of those prosecuted for witchcraft in Scotland were executed. I mentioned that we really turned that down. We made it a lot easier to get acquitted in our version of the game, just because it worked better from gameplay, out from the gameplay perspective. You know, it's not fun for players if they get executed right at the start and then have to sit there not doing anything. So there's areas like that where we were continually making these compromises between game design and history, and then just trying to keep it all concise and condensed was the other really difficult part of this. We ended up introducing these story cards, which are something you can sort of turn over as the game progresses. So there's one for the beginning of the game, there's one for your first accusation, there's one that guides you through the trial process, or actually 6, and so on. So they're there to provide a bit more of the historical context, to just give a bit more of the information that we couldn't otherwise sort of crowbar into the game. But you could also play without them if you want to have a sort of quicker and more streamlined experience. So yeah, lots of these compromises that we had to try and find. So yeah, it was a real learning experience for me, just in terms of how games do get, you know, useful for classrooms, how you can make them into something that people can use as a learning tool.
So it sounds like you and the students who designed these games learned a ton and really had an amazing time together. But when you use this game with kind of future groups of students, what kinds of learning are you seeing in your classroom? And does it make you more or less likely to keep using games as a learning tool going forward?
I think it works well. I use it as a sort of beginning to a discussion. So we'll take half an hour of our class time to play the game. And then I'll say to the students, okay, so what do we get out of this about how the witch hunts operated? What do you feel the game reflected well? What did the game not reflect well? You know, draw on the reading that you've done for this class, please. And, you know, what can we think from this about how and why the witch trials happened? And it just gives students a way into the topic. You know, it's hopefully made them relax a bit around each other in the first instance. I like to use it early in my module when the students still don't know each other that well, and it just helps them to sort of interact with each other and have those, you know, have a teammate at the table and have rivals, and it, you know, creates a little bit of drama and gets them laughing and so forth when they're interacting with each other. But then, yeah, it's just a sort of way for them to start thinking about, okay, you know, what this card talked about. Oh, this thing, you know, this thing about animals falling sick. So, oh yeah, that matches that thing I found in the reading that I was doing about how this could be a trigger for accusations against people in a community or whatever. Just that way of sort of getting ideas flowing. I mean, you could, of course, also use it to have a conversation about public history, about how we do history, how we communicate history. You could have the conversation about what topics it's appropriate to look at through games. You know, ask, do you feel this was sensitive? Do you feel this was an appropriate way to look back at the witch hunts? Or do you think it's problematic to laugh while we are looking at this topic? I think that could be a really, really fascinating conversation. And, you know, there's lots of different legitimate views people can take on that. So I think there's various directions you can take it in from a teaching perspective. But yes, personally, I use it to develop a longer conversation about the witch hunts and just get ideas flowing, get the students sort of, you know, warmed up and comfortable with each other as well.
Oh, that's super interesting. So you touched on a topic that is just one of my hobby horses, so I'm going to ask a question about it. Which is, we talk about games, I think, differently from the way we talk about other media. Like, oh, is it okay to make a game about this? But it would never be considered a problem to write a novel about witch hunts, or to, you know, read about them, or have a play, you know, Crucible. Um, but, you know, what does make games different? And like, this is something that I ask everybody, because I'm just always really interested in that perspective.
Well, I think we associate games first and foremost with fun, right? You've got the phrase fun and games, gameplay, it's all about sort of sitting down for enjoyment is our association with games, to laugh together. It's not necessarily something that we associate with hard-hitting messages that we have to go away and reflect on. Whereas I think we are much more used to thinking of novels, theatre as something that can be traumatic, something that can encourage people to think about really, really difficult topics, something that can provoke negative emotions and force people to have to work through those. I think we're really accustomed to the idea that those other art forms can do this. It's normal for them to do this. So it's sort of normal to use those as a way to explore human darkness, and reflect on how we can be more empathetic, better people, whatever, going forwards. I think that's just not done as much with games. It is starting to be, I think, but a lot of people, their first association is still Monopoly or something, which I'm sure does induce a lot of dark feelings and a lot of trauma and so on. But it's not doing that same thing of encouraging people to think really seriously about historical topics. And I mean, I will readily admit that we also wanted the game to be fun. It was something we were thinking of as we were designing it. How can we make this enjoyable? We want people to have a fun time playing a game while also dealing with these heavy topics and hopefully going away to think about them a bit more. And, I think perhaps hard-hitting theatre doesn't necessarily set out to be fun in the same way. So I think it is fair to say that there's a difference. At the same time, I'm personally really interested in how games can do more to explore these darker topics. And of course, it's done, we see it done a lot in video games, which, as often longer experiences, have a bit more scope to develop these things fully and in detail. But I think tabletop gaming is doing this as well. It's just perhaps not as commonly known in the public sphere at the moment.
Yes, let's just say that fun and engaging are a very heavy overlap for me. So, and then this is just a witch hunt question. So we touched earlier in this interview on how, just kind of local squabbles about sick cows and failed crops and just people getting cranky with each other in kind of small village settings can lead to you were in the forest having sex with the devil and eating babies. And I know that there's not a real answer for this, but because you're an expert on the topic, how do we get there? How? It's a very wild thing. And also, how do you I do find it hard emotionally to connect with that setting and feel as much empathy as I should for the people in it, because once you throw that out, I'm like, what? And I'm an ancient historian. I hear my share of weird stuff about the Romans too, but how do you help students, I guess, kind of get into some sort of logical chain that includes that eventuality?
Yeah, I think that's one of the real challenges in trying to approach this topic in an empathetic way. That, as soon as we get into all the demonic stuff, you're sort of off in the realm of fantasy, and it just becomes a lot harder to get your brain to process this as a serious thing that has implications for how we treat each other in the modern day and age as well. Because it's very easy to go, oh, that was just all nonsense. And at least in the Western world, typically within mainstream society, these kind of accusations are not getting thrown around anymore. But what we see is that the accusations do begin with all of the normal and the mundane stuff, the people falling ill and that seeming a little bit weird, people using too many resources, which is very much still a theme that we'll see in modern day community conflict, tensions around sort of money, or just all the kind of squabbles that naturally occur when you live in close surroundings with other human beings. And the demonological stuff, what we might term the weird stuff, the Satan, the sort of rituals, the kind of voodoo dolls, things like that, is stuff that gets introduced later on by your interrogators, by these people who are coming at this with this schooling in demonology that your local villagers do not necessarily share. So it's something that's getting injected into the process later on. And in fact, often it didn't enter the process at all. Local trials would very commonly only feature harmful magic against other individuals in the neighborhood and not bring in any demonic component whatsoever. We wanted to bring in the demonic component for the game because it's stuff people know about and stuff people are interested in, and felt that it would be more representative to include it, so just to give people that sort of into the stuff they were expecting, perhaps. But yeah, it would actually be a more accurate vision of trials to say they were very heavily about just harmful magic against other individuals, causing illness most commonly, or poverty, hardship of one kind or another. And I think that's less of a mental leap for us. The idea that when something's gone wrong for you in your life, maybe it's that other person's fault.
Yeah.
I think that's easier to see how that's something that still happens in communities now. Blaming your poverty on that person down the road who is using too much of this resource or whatever it might be, rather than that neighbour's off out in the woods at the night meeting with Satan. So yeah, that was again the reason why we tried to keep this all grounded as far as possible in the world of the community. So why the game starts with putting you in this community where you're doing these normal community things, building up your farm, whatever it might be, facing, having little squabbles with your local church and its expectations for you, dealing with these different events. And that it's later on that your weird satanic stuff comes in, and that it's coming actually from just this different school of thinking on what witches were and what they did. This school that was heavily influenced by European demonological tracts and so forth. So yeah, again, I'm not sure how well we've communicated this. The aim was to try and say that this is all begins with sort of what we might term normal stuff, and stuff that makes some sense to us as a cause of conflict and as a cause of tension, and stuff which can relatively easily be related to modern day society.
And that leads me to one more serious question before we do kind of like wrap up, which is, it sounds like so you had to tone down the lethality of these trials. How do you go from, I think my neighbor looked at me with an envious eye and my cow is sick, to this person should die? And, how serious did your alleged relationship with Satan have to be to get you killed in this time period? It seems like also like the line between religion and magic is so thin. If you're really like a specialist in the area, right? Like how far is a prayer where you ask for something to happen away from a charm that's supposed to encourage something to happen? Those lines are so flexible. So, at what point are you, like what gets you killed versus what gets somebody to be mad at you at the bar and you punch it out, you're done?
Well, it's typically not necessarily your local neighbours, the people who have first brought accusations against you, who are deciding that you should get executed. That's something that happens in the courtroom, where you've got a group of jurors, a commissioner who are drawn from your elites, your educated men. So there's a sort of divide there in the first instance. People who said, oh, this person looked at me funny and now my cow's sick, are not necessarily saying, I want this person to die. They're saying, I feel a bit weird about this person. They might go and speak to their local minister about their concerns, perhaps. The local minister brings them in for an interrogation. Then the local minister might start saying, oh, this person's in league with Satan. And that's when it starts becoming a really serious matter. That's when it starts becoming something that's of concern to the nation as a whole, because they are part of Satan's team of minions working to try and derail Scotland and push it off its Christian path. So yeah, it's the local neighbourhood tensions wouldn't necessarily have led to lynchings. without this other context then sort of coming in and giving that shape to the accusations and turning them into something with these very, very dark implications. But yes, you're absolutely right that there's this really, really fine line between religion, folklore, magic. The local church is continually struggling with this. You know, it wants people to be devout. Your ministers want people to pray, to believe in God, of course, to believe that God's providence is dictating every little thing that happens around them, to believe in the devil, to believe that the devil might be trying to seduce them and their neighbors, and that they have to be careful of that. And it's also very, very difficult for the local church to prevent this from spiraling off into all kinds of other forms of magical thinking that the church does not approve of.
Right.
So, you know, things like the Scottish Kirk tries to stop people from doing pilgrimages to holy wells, which is a remnant of Catholicism, which remains popular in local communities after the 1560 Reformation. It tries to stop people from using amulets or charms, which was seen as superstitious. It tries to clamp down on people who worked as charmers or cunning people, people who performed magical services for a community, so-called white magic, guarding against witches, protecting crops, that sort of thing. But for your average villager, a lot of this stuff is probably a bit jumbled up. It's a little difficult to know why one thing is orthodox when this other thing, which sounds quite closely related, is not, was inappropriate or whatever. So yes, you are living as an early modern Scot in this context where you have all of these religious ideas, sort of deeply rooted in your ways of thinking about the world, your ways of seeing the world. And it's not such a huge leap to get from that to the satanic stuff. So yeah, that is another sort of important thing to appreciate when we try to make sense of how this happened, that you have to begin with the idea that this religious worldview is deeply ingrained for people, and that, the Bible says witches exist. If you're going to be closely following the word of God, then you are fearing that Satan is at work in your community, potentially turning people into witches and so forth. So yeah, I think appreciating that religious context is crucial to making sense of the whole thing. But it is also helpful to realize, as I said at first, that neighbors are not necessarily going, let's murder this person,
Right.
It sort of snowballs from there. It gets caught up in this court process. And in fact, your chances of getting executed would vary widely depending on which court process you went through. There were two different models. You could either be tried locally, which on 1649 only uses the local trial model, or you could be tried centrally, which meant you were taken to Edinburgh, to the Court of Justiciary there. If you were lucky enough to be tried in Edinburgh, you had a much higher chance of being acquitted because you tended to be given legal representation. You'd have a defense lawyer, which you wouldn't for local trials unless you were rich enough to afford one. And it was presided over by trained judges rather than just local elites who have been granted a commission to run a trial. So the Edinburgh trials tended to be much more stringent about the evidence they would accept, and had much higher rates of acquittal. The local trials, you're to some degree at the mercy of people with no legal training, who are coming together and bringing all of their own fears and worries about what evil might be happening in their communities. So yeah, it's the sort of legal framework in which this is all operating is another way to try and understand it. That the more sort of local the trials were, the more kind of slapdash it tended to be by modern legalistic standards. And that's another way we can understand the resulting high rate of execution.
Man, I could probably talk to you about this for another hour, but you have young kids, so let's wrap it up with. So I know that you are busy being a parent right now, but are you playing any games for fun at the moment?
We just got Frosthaven. So it came in a very, very, very large box. So that is the current project when both children are asleep. But the baby does not typically get to sleep until quite late, so we haven't got very far through it yet. Um, but yeah, no, that's the diversion when we get the time for it at the moment.
I love it. And if people wanted to follow your work, ask you questions, where can you be found online?
So marthamcgill.co.uk, there's a link from there to Witch Hunt 1649, which has all of the information about the game and historical resources related to it and so forth. The game is available for free download. If you can face printing and cutting out nearly 200 cards, then you are very, very welcome to play it by that means. Or if people do want to buy a copy, then we donate all of the proceeds to a charity that works with victims of sexual assault. So yeah, it's sort of available for a good cause. But yeah, marthamcgill.co.uk.
Fantastic. Martha, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I've really enjoyed this conversation and I really enjoy you taking the time. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here. And yeah, I would love to hear from anybody who would like to talk more about this.
All right. And then, so for those of you who are listening, hopefully, I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.